Tashidele, everybody. My name is Laila Tara, and I welcome you all to the expert panel discussion today on crafting legitimacy in exile, the case of Tibetan democracy. I am very happy to, on the behalf of the Tibet Network, welcoming this panel of great experts today. We have Dhardon Sharling, we have Dr. Fiona McConnell, and Professor Dibyesh Anand. And Dhardon is going to do the moderation today, so she'll introduce the panel to you in a minute. But I just wanted to come on quickly and welcome everyone on behalf of the Tibet Network, but also let you know that there will be a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube, you can just put down any questions that you might have into the comment section. And depending on how many questions there are, how much time we have, I hope most of them will be discussed by our experts today. So without further ado, Dhardon, please take it away, and everyone, please enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Laila and the International Tibet Network for putting this forum together. It is actually the Thanksgiving morning here in the US, so quite eerie and very quiet here, especially in my college town in Amherst. But I woke up feeling very upbeat, not just because we're doing this discussion, but because of who I'm going to be sharing the screen with. So let me do the honors of introducing our two very esteemed speakers. I would say, let me begin with Professor Dibyesh Anand, who I've had the pleasure of moderating for a few of his discussions in both Dharamsala and Delhi. Professor Dibyesh is the head of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Westminster in London. He is an elected staff governor, a co-chair of EDI committee and of Black and ethnic and minority ethnic staff network as well. He is the author of the monographs Geopolitics Exotica, Tibet in Western Imagination. Also another very important scholarship titled Hindu Nationalism in India and the Politics of Fear, and many other articles and book chapters in the areas of post-colonial politics and international relations. Dibyesh is passionate about challenging the divide between academia and activism, something that I aspire to achieve, and because of which he's been a very important role model for me for the last 10 years. And Dibyesh believes in embedding equality, diversity, and inclusion in every aspect of his life. And I think he is a man who kind of really lives up to his rhetoric of embedding equity, justice, division, and inclusion, considering how he's been a champion for people who are marginalized, even with the Tibetans as well, apart from Kashmir and other regions. So I am very, very happy to be hosting this discussion with Professor Dibyesh. Welcome on board. I'm also equally honored to be introducing Professor Fiona McConnell, who teaches political geography and is a tutorial fellow at St. Catherine's College. Driving much of her research has been an interest in how communities who are officially excluded from the formal state politics are nevertheless engaging with aspects of statecraft and in using such seemingly anomalous cases as a lens to critically examine the norms of governance. And that's why the Tibetan government in exile and its exile functionary, or the whole democratization process, is of deep interest to Professor Fiona. Her doctoral research focused on political institutions and the practices of the exiled Tibetan government based in India, and has been published in journal articles and a monograph researching the state, the political practices of the Tibetan government in exile. I would like to mention that earlier Monday, right? This week, Monday, I was at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., I was invited to deliver a guest lecture on the topic valuing Tibetan democracy. And when I was asked for some reading list that the professor could recommend to his grad students who are learning democracy promotion, I actually recommended this monograph and a very important chapter on crafting legitimacy in exile. So the students found it deeply interesting and engaging, and it offered them a lot of insight, especially for people who are hearing this for the first time. So it's a great work of peace, I must say. Professor Fiona has an ongoing interest in how political legitimacy is claimed, constructed, and contested, particularly in the so called margins of geopolitics and in the practice of peace, diplomacy, and mediation. Um, I'm also very interested that this discussion is taking place at a time when the global political discourse kind of really seemed to be shifting, right? To the far right. We are in the eighth month of Russia's assault on Ukraine, and it's ongoing. It never seems to abate. And just last month, right, we saw Xi Jinping's ascension to power, unlimited, uninterrupted power. And we also see the tightly contested midterm elections in the US. We saw how the UK saw more than five prime ministers in the last 5 years, right? And then we saw the climate summit in Egypt, right, which does come as a disappointment, especially when climate change seemed to be the existential crisis. And then I think it's very important to pivot to this unique case of Tibetan democracy in exile, which has not failed, which has not faltered, which kind of inspires awe, motivates action, piques interest. And I think it's the right time in this critical moment to really pivot to this democracy in exile and what it has to offer, and especially concerning questions of legitimacy, because the Tibetan government in exile and the democracy on a daily basis is striving for legitimacy. And in that pursuit poses a challenge to China's legitimacy over Tibet. And so, on that note, I'd like to open the discussion. I'd like to first welcome Professor Dibyesh to weigh in on this topic.
Thank you so much, International Tibetan Network, for having me here, Dhardon, for such a generous introduction. I don't think I deserve all of it, but what I do know and what I can agree with you is that we have shared passion for challenging injustices that take place in the world. Now, if you look at the world now, often, I mean, in your case, or people, if they're listening to us or they might listen to us later, when it comes to Tibet, we know we talk about human rights. So when I started focusing on Tibetan question in the West, frankly, I was very ignorant about in India when I was growing up there. We did not know about it. I studied in Delhi University, St. Stephen's College in mid-90s. No one talked about Tibet. And imagine this is where the Dalai Lama was there in India. And I was politically quite active. We spoke about Palestine. We spoke about Burma at that point in time. But we never spoke of Tibet. Came to the West. This is 1997. That's more than like 25 years ago. Came here. 7 years in Tibet was here. Kundun Fin was here. And whenever Chinese leaders would come to the West, there would be protests. So I was very curious about why so much of interest in Tibet. And that's how my journey started. So what I felt was that, of course, in the West, there was greater awareness of what was happening to Tibetans in Tibet and beyond. And yet, through my own work, I found that there's limitation to how much of the support was about Tibetans being uniquely victimized by China, Tibetans being very religious people, culturally very distinct, and these are important. But somehow it was never about more than human rights. So much of the discourse of save Tibet, and this is the difference. A lot of people now could talk of free Tibet. So I'll use the word free Tibet, but they would talk of save Tibet. Now, the language of save Tibet and Tibetans is almost of someone going extinct and us as enlightened people saving them. And what I felt was there was a paternalistic or patronizing aspect to that saving Tibet and Tibetans. So much of the discourse in the West then was about saving Tibet and Tibetans, where we as good Westerners would save Tibetans from what the ruthless Chinese, and that's important, we do it. But not empowering and not seeing Tibetans as active global citizens who are being occupied, right? So my next stage, and I've worked on that, and I've shared my ideas with some of you. You would not be surprised about what I'm saying, but maybe for others it's important that the way I see what's happening in Tibet is very clear. It is a case of contemporary colonization. It's not simply a military occupation. It's not simply a temporary occupation. It is very much a full-fledged colonial occupation. And again, I don't have time to go into it, but you can read my work, again, listen to me, and I can explain that maybe if you want later during the session. But it's contemporary colonization taking place under China. So we know it's clearly that China is an authoritarian state, and sometimes even Tibetans would talk of China being a communist state and Tibetan being victim of communist state. Now, does that imply that if China becomes more capitalist or becomes more politically democratic, does it imply necessarily decolonization for Tibetans? I would argue no, because when you look at the world around us, and I gave example of Turkey vis-a-vis Kurds, or India vis-a-vis Kashmiris, or Pakistan vis-a-vis Baloch, we do see different forms of democracies, but them being quite colonizing themselves. So I don't think shift of China from being communist authoritarianism to a democratic system necessarily implies decolonization of Tibetans. Now, that's the second part to bear in mind. Therefore, the struggle for Tibetans is not only for democracy inside China, but it's for survival, it's for decolonization. And an important aspect of decolonization, of course, is democracy in exile. So we have got, in case of Tibetans, a democracy in exile, and democracy is very crucial. And while there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's some awareness of how that democracy functions amongst Tibet scholars, I do find it quite disturbing, and I'm being very frank. I'm a frank person, those of you know me, is among Tibet scholarship. So I'm not talking of Tibetans. In the Tibet scholarship, and again, it would not be a surprise for you, Dhardon or Fiona, for you, you'd find that most people who work on Tibet hardly talk of Tibetan democracy in exile. They'll focus on 7th century Tibet, great. 13th century, 15th century, talk about development in a particular village, in a particular part of Tibet. All of these are very important. But the moment Fiona will talk of, I don't know your experience, I'm not putting words into your mouth, but we'll talk of Tibetan democracy in exile. How can the world learn from it, or how to analyze critically? There's almost a skepticism. And I do wonder about that skepticism. Okay, maybe that I do during the next question, maybe is why is there so much of skepticism or lack of awareness or disinterest that a lot of Tibet-related scholars have in Tibetan democracy? My answer is very clear. Because that paternalism, which I talked about earlier, still persists. So the idea is Tibetan democracy is not taken seriously, which is wrong. Now, so the legitimacy part, and this is doubly disturbing or multiply disturbing, because the only way in which Tibetans can show and have been showing to the world that they're different from Chinese system is not through reincarnation system. It's not through only Dalai Lama. I know, respect Dalai Lama. He's the national leader. He's the unifying figure. But a struggle is not about the Dalai Lama. And Dalai Lama himself said multiple times, he can't say more than what he has said is, look, this is not about me. This is not about Tulkus. This is not about religion. This is about Tibetans as nation, Tibetans people. So the key legitimizing factor in exile that makes Tibetans different from Tibetans in Tibet who are occupied or Chinese system is that they have a functioning democracy. So I would say, therefore, it is very much about legitimacy, but legitimacy not only to bring Tibetans together in exile, but legitimacy in terms of being the main vehicle for decolonization of Tibet by decolonizing China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dibyesh. I think you kind of really hit the right spot, because when you said when it comes to Tibet scholarship or scholarship related to Tibet, be it, not just Tibet, of course, not just within the academy and outside of it, even within the experts, there's very less focus on Tibetan democracy. And I couldn't agree more with you, because As I said in the beginning of the introduction, I was at the Georgetown University this Monday, and I was delivering a guest lecture on valuing Tibetan democracy, also talking about questions of legitimacy. And we had 12 students, and I said, before I started the class, I said, tell me one thing, that is at the top of your mind when you hear the word Tibet. And I had 12 things come. It is all suppression, oppression, China, suffering, the Himalayas, um, India, US support, but none on democracy. And I was quite taken aback because the session was actually on democracy. And despite that, it remained so invisible. And that's why I think, the work that you and Fiona does, right, in really kind of bringing it from the margins to the mainstream, I think it's crucial. I think it's really a timely intervention, I must say. And I think, Dibyesh, when you say, the fact that there is a Tibetan democracy in exile and the whole decolonization process associated with it, I was really intrigued by how we could also look at this Tibetan democracy functioning lively as ever, as and when we speak, as also a kind of a decolonial method, right? And as an expression of political resistance, a non-violent political resistance, because our fight or a struggle is definitely with this China's use of unlimited power and authority over Tibet, trying to kind of really control the Tibet narrative. And the fact that there is a democracy in exile kind of really poses not only a threat, but questions the legitimacy of China's rule over Tibet, which is well in its 63rd year. So thank you. And we will pause on that note because I'm sure there will be a few more kind of discussions to that effect during the Q&A round. I would now like to turn to Fiona to really kind of not only expand on your work, but really kind of bring an insight into how, for you, having studied Tibetan government and exile and this whole democratization of the exile polity, what does it have to offer, not only just to scholars and to kind of really strengthening scholarship on democracy as such, but beyond that, especially in a tightly contested world where moral values seem to be really kind of taken for a ride? Over to you, Fiona.
Many thanks, Dhardon, and thanks to Lila Tara as well for the invitation. And I think, Dhardon, as you set out really clearly at the start, I think it's a really opportune moment to turn a spotlight on Tibetan democracy, right? I think it's a case that really carves out an aspirational, a positive, and a hopeful path in what are, I think we'd agree, geopolitically very dark times at the minute. So in the time that I've got, what I wanted to do was really very briefly sketch out, the evolution of Tibetan democracy, some of its very unique traits. It's a very unusual established democracy. And then again, to think about that connection between democracy and legitimacy. And as you've just said, kind of what we can learn from that as an example that is so often overlooked. So I think to set a little bit of context, most people obviously are aware that historically political power within Tibet was largely held by the Dalai Lamas, on whose behalf government ministers ruled. However, the current Dalai Lama was really interested in democracy as a political system when he was a young man inside Tibet. In 1950, so 9 years before he fled into exile, he had said in his own words that he'd come to the conclusion that democracy was, a system based on economic and social justice, and one that he would like to start to institutionalize within the Tibetan society. He did introduce a number of progressive changes inside Tibet, but those initiatives were impeded, obviously, by the Chinese authorities. So whilst we can see some kind of antecedents to democracy in pre-1959 Tibet, the exile community who came into India in the tens of thousands in the 1960s had no direct experience of democratic governance. So this really is a very young democracy in that way. And this participatory mode of democracy really is the first time that in Tibet's history that it's been institutionalized. And of course, it's evolved massively since the 1960s. It's widened, it's become more developed, more established, through a series of reforms led by His Holiness. 1990, I think, was a real turning point when His Holiness introduced a number of reforms to really accelerate the democratization process. So increase the number of MPs, increase the power of the Tibetan Parliament in exile, formulated the Charter in 1991, established again local assemblies in Tibetan settlements. This idea that democracy permeates the entire exile community is a really important one to stress. Established an independent election commission. So a series of reforms and mechanisms to really institutionalize Tibetan democracy. And I think, speak to a lot of Tibetans, and it's a real source of pride as well. This establishment, established from scratch, evolved over the decades. And I think it's really important also to acknowledge that it's come of age in recent years as well, right? If you think of the last few rounds of elections for MPs and Sikyong, there've been really lively political debates in cities right across the world, right? There've been hustings broadcast live on the internet, candidates actively campaigning for election, right? We can see the growth of independent Tibetan media, civil society really active. All those kind of features of a really healthy democracy, I think, are present in the Tibetan case. So again, something I think a lot of diaspora communities could really learn from. It's also a really unusual democracy. And I think that's really important to stress, and unusual in a number of ways. First of all, most democracies, if you think about the history of democratic governance, are bottom up, right? It's either a popular uprising or a revolt, or the local people demand this mode of political governance. Tibetan case, it's been the opposite. It's been imposed from the top down. Right, His Holiness declared that the Tibetan community would engage in democratic politics. So a very different kind of evolution and instigation of democracy within the community. There's a really strong role of Tibetan cultural and religious values underpinning this mode of democracy in a range of features. Most notably, I think the fact it's a partyless democracy, right? As I'll say in a minute, candidates for MPs stand on a series of quota systems rather than representing political parties. And we can trace this back as well to actually trying to set a particular tone for the nature of political debate within the community that is more cooperative than confrontational, right? So I think there's really distinctive features, again, that I think other democracies could look to and learn from there as well. A really distinctive feature, as I've said, is this kind of quota system. So usually democracies are based, and I'm a geographer, on territorial constituencies, right? You vote for your local MP who will represent the area where you reside. That's not the case for most of the MPs in the Tibetan parliaments, right? So there's this complex but very strategically established symbolic quota system underpinning how the 45 Tibetan MPs are elected. 30 of whom are elected to represent the 3 traditional regions of Tibet, so 10 from each. And members of the Tibetan electorate in the diaspora vote according to where they or their parents, or I suppose now even grandparents, are from inside Tibet. And as I'll come back to in a minute, that's a really important link to the homeland, and it's done strategically. So we have that. We've got 10 members elected to represent the 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism and the traditional Bon faith. So again, making sure that Tibetan cultural identity is really at the heart of this democratic system as well. And then there is a nod to the wider diaspora as well. So we've got 5 MPs elected by Tibetan diaspora in the West as well. So a more kind of conventionally territorial constituency. So I think this is a really important way of kind of institutionalizing the homeland and the connection back to historic Tibet within the democratic system itself. Now, there are limitations to this as well, and I think that's important to acknowledge, right? And there's limitations to all of those kind of unique traits, right? The fact that it was being imposed from the top down means there's maybe arguably a lack of ownership of Tibetan democracy, right? But I think that's evolved, and I think we see that a lot more so in recent years. There's the issue around the symbolism of the the constituencies, right? The fact you're voting according to a territory in the homeland rather than where you live in exile, right? So there's issues around kind of local politics, but again, some of that's addressed with local assemblies, so that has been taken into account. But I think other diaspora communities could really learn an awful lot from the Tibetan case, and I think key to that is the role that Tibetan democracy plays in terms of, as I said, crafting legitimacy for the exiled Tibetan administration. Because like so many exile governments, and I think we could stretch it to de facto states, these political entities lack legality, right? Which comes down to not being recognized as international actors, right? So crucially, don't have a seat at the UN or other international forums, aren't able to sit as equals in bilateral agreements or any of them. So huge barriers to lacking legality in the international system. But what I think the Tibetan government in exile, the CTA, does really well is seek to carve out legitimacy, even when that legality is denied. And I've been thinking a lot about, well, how do you go about claiming legitimacy? And I think part of it is around enacting a particular mode of authority, right? Having this established state-like bureaucracy, providing services for the exile community, right? This idea of a social contract is really important. But I think the thing that trumps all of this is developing democratic structures, right? And I think I just want to kind of end by sketching out, I think there are kind of 4 ways that democracy, in the Tibetan case, articulates really clear claims to legitimacy. The first is, as you've hinted at, Dhardon, in comparison to China. And this was really strategic. Since its very inception, Tibetan democracy has that kind of implicit aim of setting contemporary Tibetan political culture apart from, and I think apart from 2 things. One is kind of pre-1950s Tibet and the older political systems that were in part, the kind of theocratic structures, and crucially contemporary Chinese rule inside Tibet, right? And it's setting really clear water. And a number of scholars have written about this, and it's really about rebuking Chinese propaganda that that Tibetan independence would be a reversion to theocratic feudalism. And it's, ensuring that the exile administration occupies the moral high ground in comparison to one-party rule inside the homeland. So there's a clear kind of signaling there going on. There's obviously also the international audience for this, right? Engagement with Western liberal democracies, being able to demonstrate those kind of classic good governance institutions. Another aspect of the legitimizing role of Tibetan democracy as well is the future of Tibetan governance and politics in a kind of what happens after the current Dalai Lama passes away. And His Holiness has been very clear with his formal resignation from politics in 2011, and this handing over of political authority to the Sikyong and the elected representatives. It's about ensuring stability as well. It's very strategic. And again, these are the legitimately elected representatives of the community. So there's this idea of continuity then that really is very important. And what I've written about as well is this evolution of Tibetan democracy and the fact that it's undergone these changes and it's been experimented with. And it's this idea, well, it's being practiced in exile, but the end goal, of course, is to implement these modes of democracy inside the homeland, in some future Tibet. And this idea that you can demonstrate you can do it, right? And fine tune it and see how it works in various cultural and religious registers as well. And then finally, and this is a really tricky one for diaspora communities, is that legitimacy vis-a-vis the majority population who are inside the homeland, right? Who are not enfranchised, crucially, right? Who can't vote anywhere, essentially, right? They can't vote in the Chinese system, and they can't vote for the Central Tibetan Administration elections either. And I think here that formalization through the kind of symbolic link to territories in the homeland and through religious identities in the way that the parliament system is set up is kind of the next best thing, right? And it's almost trying to include the majority population by proxy, right? And to keep that population in mind when people go to the ballot box and elect. So really, I'll wrap up and just say, this is a very young but successful case of democracy. It's experimenting in really innovative ways with how to run democracy transnationally, right? The fact that Tibetans all vote on the same day across the world, across 4 continents, is really quite amazing. And really have experimented with how you structure and how you think about these different constituencies and integrating that symbolically. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Dhardon.
Thank you, Fiona. I think in less than 10 minutes, how you were able to really present this multi-dimensional aspect of what Tibetan democracy is, from a scholarly point of view, from a strategic standpoint, from the legality praxis. So I think it really, for a Tibetan who's kind of grown up, I think, in this democracy, who's been a subject of this unique democracy, and the process which also kind of really shaped my subjectivity and who I am today, right? To be able to hear this level of critical slash intellectual insight into what we are made of, right? I think definitely, as a Tibetan, it gives me immense sense of pride, I must say. And I loved the fact that you really kind of pointed to how the Tibetan democracy, the one we have now, is really showing a mirror to Tibet's past, which we don't regret, but we don't want to replicate, right? The pre-1959 era, where it was strictly feudal slash theocratic. And then what is on ground at the present under the Chinese rule, right? Something we want to resist, something we want to resolve, right? And that's why this democracy works like a vehicle, right? That is really working to effect change. And I loved how you brought in that analogy of this social justice praxis to this democracy, why the democratic principles of equality, liberty, justice kind of really were the foundational blocks that really inspired His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The first thing on his mind while escaping, right? From Tibet, it was not food, it was not the material things, but it was this conceptual process of crafting democracy. And thanks to his strategic vision, right? 63 years down the line, we're still there, we're still thriving, and there is a dominant Tibet narrative. And as I said in my introductory remark, how the fact that we exist poses a largest challenge to the Chinese legitimacy over Tibet. The fact that we're here, and Fiona, you really pointed out to how, although 97% of the constituents who are in Tibet are not enfranchised, so if democracy is all about the ballot box, then maybe it might not apply in this case. But the way the parliamentary elections are structured, again, there's a lot of strategy in there. And all these were devised 63 years ago, right? When we were still dealing with hardships, rehabilitation process, the whole massive challenge of rebuilding a lost nation in exile. And really, as a Tibetan, as an adult Tibetan, I must say, no longer a young Tibetan, I look back and I'm just completely in awe. And that's why I agree with both Dibyesh and Fiona as to why this model should be at the heart of the matter, not just in academy, but in different political institutions and elsewhere. And that's why it's something to really focus on and make it the centerpiece. So on that note, I have a question, and I'd like to throw it open to both of you for you to weigh in, but I'd like to really request that you take no more than 2 minutes each to really engage with that question. So the whole idea of a democracy in exile, and when there's democracy, there's room for dissension, for disagreements, right? But then the exile democracy, especially the parliamentary form of democracy we have today, which is kind of really driven by a unified vision that's restoring freedom in Tibet. How does that aspiration and the fact that democracy allows room for what do you call it? Really, I mean, not ugly fights, but at least room for disagreement, sometimes which can get a little unhealthy at times. So do you see it as mutually incompatible, especially as non-Tibetans, I would say, who's someone who has not been party to this democratic setup. So how do you see that conflict and tension, and how do you think as Tibetans we were able to manage it thus far? I'll go with Dibyesh first, and in 2 minutes I would like to take it over to Fiona.
Thank you again, Fiona. Amazing presenter. I learned a lot, and every time I read your work and listen to you, I was this is so amazing. So what Dhardon was saying was correct about your work. It's very important we read it. Now, in terms of Dhardon, your question about dissent and everything. Look, democracy is about majority rule, minority right, and right to dissent without fear. There's no compromise on that. Now, of course, the struggle that the Tibetan democracy in exile faces is first the question of legitimacy. 97% people can't vote. But frankly, that question of legitimacy ought to be sent back to China. That do they allow that 97% of people the voice? So if anyone questions Tibetan democracy in exile, that how do you claim to represent the 3%? That question should be not claim 97. That question should be sent back. Ask China. Don't ask us. So that's number one. So we have to be rhetorically very clear there. Now, of course, it is an anti-colonial trope, the democracy. It's to show we are different from China. It is about building nation. So in that sense, there's an extra burden / responsibility on Tibetan democracy in exile compared to others where they have to build a nation, right? Without a state, because a stateless nation, I use the word stateless nation for Tibet, right? So build a nation without having a state. It has to be anti-colonial. It has also represent different constituencies. It's doing great job. But, and this is an important thing to bear in mind, that no national movement is based simply on unity. Or rather, unity does not imply absence of differences. And therefore, if there's an expectation that somehow all Tibetans who are voting in democracy and parting in democracy somehow have to stick to one idea alone, I think that would be a disservice to Tibetan nationalism. It will be doing disservice to anti-colonial struggle. And of course, it will be doing disservice to Tibetan democracy. If, for instance, and I'll conclude with this, the difference over middle way, independence, something else. That's a difference over what the future of Tibet ought to be. That should not or never be used to make someone and make Tibetans feel that you are anti-national because you're holding a different position. And that is happening in Tibetan democracy in exile, and that I do think is not a healthy development. So rather than fighting with this, remember there are differences, but there's a commonality. All of you are victims of colonization. All of you are involved in some or the other kind of process of nation building in exile. That's the commonality. Other than that, there should be healthy debate.
Lovely. I can't really agree more with you, Dibyesh. I will turn it over to Fiona.
Thanks, Dhardon. Yeah, I agree with Dibyesh says, obviously, and covered a lot of the points I was going to make. I think it is a tricky situation with in the Tibetan case and other cases of exile communities, that balance between allowing debate, but also ensuring a sense of unity, and it's a tricky balancing act. I think keeping the wider kind of community engaged is really important, and keeping politicians accountable are signs of a healthy democracy. And again, I think it's always to be cautious of using unity as an excuse for shutting down debates. I think that's where you run into danger, right? And that's where democratic institutions become quite fragile. So I think it's as I said earlier, those kind of healthy indicators of a strong democracy are an open and free media, Tibetan media, and civil society, and being able to openly express opinions and hear others, and have kind of debate that is open, but also civil. I don't know that a number of democracies in the West are terribly good examples of this at the minute, but I think lessons can be learned across the board, right? But yeah, it is a particularly challenging balancing act, I think.
Definitely, Fiona and Dibyesh, and I've been actively a part of the Tibetan democracy since 2011 when I was elected to represent at the Tibetan Parliament, and I'm seeing how looks like a kid growing up, and although there's some noise and some chaos at the present moment, but I definitely would like to consider it as a building of a healthy democracy. And Fiona, you also mentioned in one of your articles how there seemed to be a transition from this passive, nonchalant functioning of a democracy as a gift from above to now maybe transitioning to a more liberal democracy, right? Where there is active expressions, and the fact that the millennials, the way they engage themselves, and now I think the next elections will be the Gen Zers who's going to really come into the fold, and that sense of continuity, right? And the more vibrant our democracy is, the more appealing it is, not only to Tibetans, but definitely to the larger share of constituents in Tibet. So thank you, both of you. And interestingly, we have some questions coming in from audience who are tuning in live. I will flag the first question. And again, I'd like to have both of you weigh in. Yes, it's from Sonika Gupta. Thank you, Fiona, for the great capture of the topic. Would you see that the Tibetan democracy has particularities that can pose challenges for its continued successful institutionalization? For example, the simultaneous existence of institutionally and effectively deeply rooted charismatic authority of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the more prosaic process of democratization. I'd like to give Fiona and Dibyesh again 2 minutes each. Over to you, Fiona, first.
Thanks, Dhardon, and thanks for the question. And actually, I think what you've just been saying, Dhardon, was kind of the answer to this. And I think it's the fact that there has been, yes, it is a challenge, but there has been this evolution of Tibetan democracy. And I think over the last kind of decade in particular, and as exactly you said, it's younger generation coming through. And I think these things were always going to take time. And it has been this shift from it being seen as a kind of a gift from above, something that was accepted and you would go along with, to a lot more kind of interactive debate, hustings, people putting forward particular standpoints and all the rest of it. And that's always going to take a bit of adjustment within the wider community, right? It's a different style of doing politics. Different political subjectivities are being enacted in this kind of way. And I think absolutely this kind of generational shift. I think we've seen this with the election of younger MPs and all the rest of it. And I think, again, with Tibetan media and civil society supporting that transition, I think these are all really healthy signs. And if we think back to 2011 and when His Holiness Dalai Lama made the announcement that he was retiring, and the general reaction to that was horror, right? And a lot of pushback against it, right? Whereas now I think, again, we can see how Tibetan political culture in exile has evolved since, and we've got this kind of healthy debate and all the rest of it. And yes, there's always going to be moments where it gets fractious or it's problematic, but it's that ability to make sure that accountability is at the heart of all of this, and there's that kind of openness and transparency about what's going on.
Absolutely, Fiona. Dibyesh, quickly, 2 minutes.
Yeah. In fact, less than that. So again, I'll just add to what Fiona has said rather than I'll even just not repeat anything. So there are, of course, challenges when you have got a charismatic leader or whatever, and it always poses challenge. But that's not only challenge in this case for Tibetan movement. You look at any movement, be it Gandhi, Nehru figure for Indian democracy when they started, or Yasser Arafat for PLO. So the reality is when you have got a leader who's seen as the symbol of the nation, these are always challenges in a democracy. But as you all pointed out, things are evolving. But of course, with Dalai Lama, there's a specific challenge because of the religious authority. But a positive aspect of that charismatic authority also is where the democracy doesn't fracture, because people know that up to a point, you can differ, but this also has a blessing of the Dalai Lama.
Right.
So in a way, while the charismatic authority can put some limit on democratization, it can also help democracy to be more confident without fracturing itself, because the key aspect, of course, of democracy in exile is not the fact that it's democracy, but that it's in exile. So I think in that sense, his presence helps the institutionalization of democracy rather than hurting it. Because those who want to defend democracy can also use his name to say, look, he wants us to have democracy, so let's have democracy.
And if I were to quickly weigh in, I think both of you really kind of really put that in a nutshell. And as a Tibetan, again, for us, we always think, hey, democracy, yes, it's a gift from above, But now we think it's a payback time, and we want to see that during the lifetime of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We want to see it not just thrive and flourish. We wanted to see it as the most successful model that modern or contemporary history has ever seen. And that's why he will see the materialization or the fruition of his vision. And I think as a Tibetan, it does come with a moral sense of responsibility as well. And that's why I think this works. The whole matrix really does work, and hopefully, it should work. We have a question actually from a Tibetan in the audience. So Wangchuk Tsering, again, the question is for both of you, 2 minutes each. So he says, as an outsider looking in, for both of you, do you think there are flaws or shortcomings that you might have noticed in the exile democratic system? Start with Fiona and then go over to Dibyesh.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's kind of, as I discussed earlier, it's those kind of unique features of Tibetan democracy. Each come with pros and cons, right? So the fact that it's partyless, arguably there's a lack of accountability because you don't have a party to whom you're accountable, and therefore have a manifesto and the like. There's this perpetuation of particular regional identities, which I know is debated. The fact that there's an extra franchise for individuals from religious communities as well. So I think all those things that are, that have been put in there strategically to make those links back to the Tibetan homeland and cultural and religious identities all come with a bit of drawback as well, right? But I think what's really striking, though, and I think this is something that it's important to retain, is that idea that nothing's fixed in stone, right? That these institutions can evolve over time. And I think that's where Tibetan democracy is in a far better position than most established democracies, right? Not only is it a younger democracy, but it doesn't have those kind of restrictions of being as part of a formal state, right? You're able to experiment with how democracy runs and is institutionalized, and that ability to be more flexible is a huge advantage, and different ideas have been toyed with at different periods. At one stage, there was a talk of having two houses, right? One that would be, again, with a link back to traditional regions in Tibet, and then a lower house that would be more conventionally associated with constituencies in exile, right? So maybe these ideas should be on the table in order to again have a democracy that is as healthy and vibrant, exactly as you've been saying, Dhardon.
Absolutely, Fiona. Over to you, Dibyesh.
So again, I'll not focus on the system because Fiona has covered that. So think of any democracy would have these institutions in place. Of course, they have their own challenges, but that Fiona's covered that. Then there will be the practice part of democracy, and there'll be a question of democratic culture. So if I focus on what the flaws are, not flaws, but the challenges, I'll use the word challenges and flaws in democratic culture and practice, I do, as an outsider, notice some flaws, which of course all of them would have, and no point whitewashing that part. And I would say the key challenge remains about the not absence of questioning, but anyone who questions is often seen as anti-national, anti-Dalai Lama, anti-XYZ, right? So I don't think that is healthy for any democratic culture, particularly for a democracy that is based on statelessness. Because the harsh reality of Tibetan democracy is very fragile also. Opportunity challenges. CTA, Central Tibetan Administration, Dhardon Sharling, is practically an NGO operating in India, and therefore the host Indian system can be quite troublesome if it wants to. So I just remind you of this to remind ourselves of the vulnerability and the precarity of Tibetan democracy in exile. So the only way in which it can be strengthened long term is if it goes beyond, so it has to have good institutions, it has to have good practices, but ultimately a genuinely democratic culture of managing differences amongst Tibetans in the society. If you don't have that, I don't think the institution will function beyond a point. That's work, that's great, but you do need more democratic culture. So I will put it back on all Tibetans in exile. So the onus is not only on CTA, it's not only those who are elected, but onus is on everyone to recognize that you can differ, but difference doesn't imply you are anti this or anti that.
Absolutely, because I think any imposition of uniformity is antithetical of what democracy is about. And I think for Tibetans, especially the younger generation, millennials, I think are completely kind of really living up to that rhetoric of fair and free discussion. And I, as a Tibetan, really hope to see that model being not only mainstream but completely normalized in the coming years, so that because for a democracy to really thrive, right, you need room for dissent, definitely. So yeah, moving on, there's also another interesting question from Wangchuk Tsering again. He says, Professor Dibyesh, but I'd like to have both of you weigh in. What are your thoughts on the practicality of the middle way approach, which is the Central Tibet Administration's official position on solving the long-standing vexed issue of Tibet? Perhaps he wants you to kind of really assess the practicality of the middle way approach in light of what and what do you call it, a quest for independence would mean, what that would signal. So I'll have Dibyesh first and then Fiona later.
Again, thanks. Very important question. This is one of the things that people talk about, but they don't talk about publicly often, because there's a whole thing of, if you say somehow that middle way is not practical, independence ought to be the ideal, you might be blamed for going against the Dalai Lama kind of stuff. Right? So, see, and I am pointing it out because, of course, those of us who follow Tibetan movement in exile, but also Tibetans, know that this use of the Dalai Lama's legitimacy and authority is often misused and abused against those who say middle way may or may not be practical. Now, as a scholar, I would say first thing, it's not my job to say what works, it's not my job to say what Tibetans should do. So I'm very clear that this might be one view that middle way has a problem, but independence approach also has a problem, right? As a scholar, I could say that, but I would never want to be in a position where I say, as Tibetan, this is what you ought to do, right? Because that itself is a privilege and arrogance, which I do not have, and I question myself. So I'm not giving you what works, what doesn't work. But as a scholar, an activist scholar, it is important we look at what is working, what's not working, what are the limitations, what not are the limitations. So the middle way I would still say is, Dalai Lama has its own wisdom of why it was provided as approach, but we have to look at what has happened in the last 10 to 15 years. What progress has it actually made? Now, given that the Chinese government is very clear that negotiating over, at one point in time, the personal status of the Dalai Lama and not Central Tibetan administration, I do think that while it's fine for Dalai Lama's approach to be seen as the mainstream one, the CTA and the government in exile should have the freedom to say, this is one approach, provided with Dalai Lama, maybe this is what we agree with, but we also have other approaches and not demonize them for being anti-Dalai Lama. You see, so that's for me the more important question here. And I would still say that, look, all of them have their own limitations. And my personal view on what works, what doesn't work is not important, but it is very important that democracy in exile allows for a healthy discussion amongst all Tibetans and Tibet supporters, what works, what doesn't work, because being stuck in this Rangzen Umelam, so middle way independence debate, which is what is happening in exile community beyond the point, is not only doing a disservice to democracy, but frankly, it's also doing disservice to the Tibetans in Tibet who may not even be part of that debate. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you. Yes, Fiona.
Dibyesh took all the words out of my mouth. Absolutely, it's not our position as scholars to say what should or shouldn't be the strategy. And I completely agree. I think being attentive to Beijing's politics and shifting geopolitics at the minute is incredibly important, and being attuned to that. I'm thinking the important work that the Tibet Network's also doing on the geopolitics of reincarnation and being very attuned to that. And also, I think coming back to your point as well, Dibyesh, of having a healthy democracy is absolutely key. And actually, one other thing to put into the mix here when we're thinking about future strategies and what's being called for is to return to the right and the principle of self-determination, which has been, I think, for quite a while sidelined. But actually, that's all about keeping political futures open. And it's got a link to democracy where it is the people, and obviously difficulties in enfranchisement, but deciding what their political future looks like, right? And what modes of cultural and economic and social development they want. So I think keeping debates as open as possible, and is just incredibly important. And it comes back to, I think, having that healthy democracy that we've seen over the last few decades, and that really is flourishing at the minute, is so important to keep hold of. Thanks, Dhardon.
Oh, yes. And I really respect your intention to kind of really not cross the boundary, may I say, to not be really kind of imposing in terms of what Tibetans should and Tibetans shouldn't. But I think you offered a very kind of an overarching insight, right? The final say is for the Tibetans to really kind of decide what they want. And I think also as a Tibetan who's been in this movement, and then stepping out a little while, being in the academy, and kind of looking at it from a critical standpoint. I think both middle way and the voice for Rangzan independence works, because I always feel that Rangzan kind of contextualizes the middle way approach, because if we were not independent, and if our quest for independence is not valid, then where does this question of the middle way approach come in, right? And I always feel that the middle way approach actually kind of humanizes the Tibetan freedom struggle, what it is about, because it comes with this intention to kind of really reconcile and willing to talk, right? As His Holiness would say, 21st century, which should be the century of dialogue, because the past century was war, brutal war, bloodshed, but 21st century. And I wish, the global audience or the global community had been more keen on following his advice. Otherwise, we would not be having this havoc that we see in eastern parts of Europe and in Russia, and Xi Jinping just being unabated, right? So I wish when His Holiness kind of throws these words of wisdom, right, you see that he finds its implementation through the Tibetan democratic setup. And that's why, for me especially, I think as a global citizen, not just as a Tibetan, I must say, why it's important for this democratic model to succeed, because it's a solution, it's a panacea to this world that seems to be paranoid at all times, right? And let me also quote Michael Van Walt, a preeminent Tibet scholar, would say is, for China, the quest for independence is extreme for them. And for us, assimilation, what China wants us to do is extreme. So at the two extremes, there has to be a kind of a middle ground, which we could leverage. And there comes in the middle way approach. So there is no middle way approach without bringing in the shadows of the voices for independence, because otherwise it would be clipping a bird's wing, right? Just with just one wing, cannot do anything. And that's why I think, for me, rather than one complicating the other, for me, one complements the other. And I think both of you really kind of put that out very clearly as well. So we have the last 1.5 minutes. So I would really want to end right on time, and before I do the formal thanks, I would also like to bring in this component of how China it's working really hard day and night to wipe out anything to do with Tibet's political history, memories of history, people's memories. And then you have at the Central Tibetan Administration, at this Kangche Kishong, at the Pargo Lane that we call it, we have the Tibet Museum. And I was intrigued by how, I mean, as someone who was a part of the Tibet Museum leadership, throughout its conception to its execution process, how memory, right? Memory plays such an important role in crafting legitimacy. And I thought that was intriguing. And then Dibyesh has been to Dharamsala a number of times. And I believe, Fiona, you'd also been there interviewing people. And I'm sure there's this something unique that non-Tibetans seem to enjoy, which is called the Ramsala hospitality. And when I was reading Fiona's work, I was also kind of intrigued by the fact that, hey, this Dharamsala hospitality is also a diplomacy in action, right? So I wanted to thank you to really kind of pointing that out and offering us a fresh perspective as to how we could also look at everything that happens in Dharamsala, the seat of Tibetan government in exile, where His Holiness is based at, right, has a rippling effect on shaping of individual subjectivities, their experiences of Tibetan democracy, and how every little thing we do on a daily basis is a form of a political non-violent resistance, questioning the legitimacy of China's rule over Tibet, signaling to the people, to the constituents in Tibet that yes, we are here alive, thriving, and I see the exiled Tibetans and the ones in the diaspora as agents of change, really involved in this important mission. So on that note, I would like to close today's forum. I wish we had more time, but I am confident that the able leadership of International Tibet Network, Mandy and Leila, will definitely offer us more opportunities like this. And this is the kind of debate we needed so much, not just for Tibet and Tibetan scholarship, but beyond that, and definitely for the real world. So thank you very much, Fiona and Dibyesh. It was an absolute pleasure. And you have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.